Well, I'm excited for this episode to have a special guest. I'm going to be talking to John Livens, who is the author of An Unexpected Journey. And I'd like to welcome you to the podcast, John.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Could you tell us just a little bit about yourself? We're going to get into some more details about the book, but just to tell us a bit of who you are right now.
Right. It's a little complicated story, but I will try to compress it. I was born in Latvia, which is a small country across from Sweden and borders on Russia and south on Lithuania and north of Estonia. And when World War II started just before, the life situation there was completely changed because the Soviets took over the country in 1941. So I lived under the Soviet occupation for about a year, and it was not a very pleasant experience. The only thing I could mention to you, at age 7, I was on the KGB wanted list, but my sister was 5. So the whole family was, fortunately, except for my father, all of us survived. And then, of course, we were there during the German occupation when the Germans drove out the Soviets. And then eventually we escaped by ship to Germany before the war ended. And we were in Germany and actually Czechoslovakia. And then Czechoslovakia got taken over by the communists. So we had another escape back to Germany. And then we came to the United States and, had a satisfying and happy life here. I was very fortunate to get good education, a couple of degrees from Harvard, and also served in the U.S. Navy flying from several aircraft carriers.
Oh, very nice. What was it that made you want to write down your story and to share it with others?
Well, that's an interesting story because I am a very private person. And as a matter of fact, I didn't talk about my past to many people before because, number one, they wouldn't understand and couldn't relate it because, as you well know, after World War II in the United States, Stalin was viewed as a friendly Joe. And, so the people really did not have the understanding. So as I retired and worked less, my wife encouraged to do this, to write down. And I started writing in a chronological manner. I had some notes, not many. But then the hardest part for me was I felt that everyone can write a chronology or a history, but I wanted to incorporate how I felt about these events. What did I learn? What perhaps they meant to me, and what perhaps they could mean to others. And that was a more difficult part. So it's sort of a personal story, not only historical, but perhaps you can reflect on your own life and learn something and appreciate how well all of us are living here.
Well, I really did enjoy your book, and there's so many good stories in there, and you have a very good ability to express those feelings and what was going on inside you. One of the stories that I really liked is how you were learning. You were starting to learn German, but you didn't like the grammar, and so you stopped your lessons. But then you realized that there were updates taking place in the house that were in German, and the only way you're going to know what was going on was to be able to understand German, even though you didn't want to speak it. I thought that was something that I think a lot of young people maybe could identify with, those kind of motivations.
Well, I think the key thing is, I think you have to adapt yourself. And if you have the ability, and most people have it, you evaluate the circumstances, and some things that do not look good at first, you can derive benefit, and it's worth taking the effort to overcome them.
Mm-hmm. Yes, wonderful. Now, the first part of your book takes place in Latvia, and I think that a lot of people are not really familiar with that country. Can you kind of position us? You've already told us where it was geographically. What was Latvia like culturally? What kind of relations did it have with other countries around it?
Well, I will give you a very brief summary and history of it. And I just have to say that I'm reasonably current what's going on, because I was in Paris about a month ago, and I sat next to dinner to the former president of Latvia. She was a president for 2 terms, and we discussed some of the issues of the past. But just to give a brief history, the country is in Northern Europe and, of course, Northeast Europe, so it's bordered by Russia. But it was, you may say, Christianized by German monks in the 1200s. And the interesting thing is, it's somewhat comparable to the modern day Vietnam. So the monks come to this country, which is populated, in their opinion, by heathens, and they bring Christianity. They want to convert them. And of course, it's not easy to do. And they did the same thing then, but we did in Vietnam, build up forts and try to convert the chiefs. So they did succeed that way. And one of my ancestors was the early converts to Christianity. And as a matter of fact, he was granted an audience at Pope Innocent III in 1200s. But anyway, so the country was ruled by bishops, by Germans. The Baltic Germans really controlled it. And then it was part of a Swedish Empire for 100 years. And then it was a vassal state of Poland. And then it, after the Great Northern War in 1700s, it became part of Imperial Russia. But they always maintained the ethnicity of the people, because the Baltic people, the Latvians and Lithuanians, are ethnically different from the Slavs. There were 3 tribes, essentially: the Old Prussians, which were squished by the Germans, and the 2 Baltic tribes, the Lithuanians and Latvians. So it's an entirely different language and ethnic roots. So they always strove for independence, but they only achieved it first time in 1918. And then they were independent until 1941, when the Soviets took over, and then they became independent again in 1992, when Gorbachev's Russia fell apart. So it's been an independent republic since then. The government's been always right of center, very pro-American, even though they have a significant Russian minority.
Okay. Now you mentioned about the Soviet takeover, and that was part of larger events that were taking place
Correct.
in Europe at that time, that Germany was invading Poland, and they had an arrangement with the Soviets that the Soviets would, as the Germans received the western part, the Soviets would receive the eastern part. And it was part of these events then that the Soviets moved into the Baltic states. Is that correct?
Yes. What happened is, as you all will remember from history, there was a Ribbentrop-Molotov Treaty, which basically the Nazi Germans and the communists divided Europe. And then after the treaty was concluded, there was a secret clause, and the secret clause of the treaty said that the Soviets could take over Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania, and of course Germans could occupy the larger part of Poland. The other part of the clause, which was not known at that time, that Hitler had the opportunity to issue a proclamation that any people claiming of German descent in these countries could go back to Germany. So you had an influx of Germans. Some of them were not really Germans, people actually of Latvian descent. You can always have some connection with the Germans. And about 2% of the population left. The rest, of course, didn't know what happened. So first the Soviets established a base, and then one day they just rolled their tanks in and took over the country. And the next step, what they did is, of course, this is not unusual for Soviets, they realized that the intelligentsia of the country was opposed to Soviets because they were proud of their country. And they arrested some of the leaders first. And then one night, they arrested about 15,500 people, which doesn't look like a big number, but it was a good part of the population, since the population was a little over 2 million, and deported them to Siberia. So they rounded them up, put them into cattle cart and shipped off to Siberia. Very few returned.
Mm-hmm.
And my connection with this is, if you are interested in the book, and I think it is an interesting turning point, we had a townhouse and as well as country places. And so we had called the superintendent of the townhouse. My mother called him and said, look, we're going to visit my father, who was living in town, who had been dismissed from his government job. And so we told the superintendent, would you please help to get the house ready? Because my mother said, I'm arriving with 2 children and all that. And he said, fine. Well, what we did not know, of course, many of the superintendents were secret informers for the KGB. So, of course, he had informed KGB, and they felt that the whole family is going to be on the June 14th at their townhouse, and they could be arrested and shipped to Siberia. Well, of course, we didn't know that. The night before we were supposed to leave, my grandmother, who had diabetes, said to my mother, please do not leave the next morning. Please do not leave. I want you to stay another night. I want to stay another night. So, it was kind of an unusual event, I suppose, divine interference, you may call. So my mother said, all right, we'll leave the next morning. So the next morning, she called my father. I walked in her room. It was about 5 o'clock or so in the morning because I heard the noise. And as she did call the father, he didn't answer. There was a borderer put in the house. He answered and he said, something is going on. And so obviously my mother understood that they were police or something. And she handed the receiver to my father. My father said, take care of the children, do what you can. And my mother immediately understood that he's being arrested and shipped to Siberia. And so the phone conversation terminated, and she took off for one city and we got shipped to another place so that KGB wouldn't get us, because they were not that rapid. Took them a while to figure out where we were. So we had to hide with different people. And the only thing that saved us, that about 10 days later, Germans attacked Russia. And of course, then shortly afterwards, they came in Latvia, we could return. But we were hiding for about 12 to 10, from June 14th till about June 25th or 6th. So.
And
So
I want to get to the German occupation in a moment, but for the Soviets, what their intentions were, it wasn't just to have political control. It was also, there was a sort of a conflict of ideologies going on, and the desire to spread communism. And so in your book, you talk about how there would be comments about how the possessions of the rich were to be taken away, and there was a real desire to turn everything upside down and impose that communist ideology in Latvia. Is that correct?
Yes, and the interesting part is, I think those people who are interested about education today, they should read that chapter, because the communists early on realized that the current generation has probably lost the way they could achieve success of their ideology, indoctrinate young children at school. So that was a very important thing in school. There was a red corner, and I still to this day remember one thing, that the heroes were children who reported their parents for counter-revolutionary activities. So in other words, the state was more important than the family and the parental relationships. So it was I grasped something that was something bad, but I was 8, 9 years old, but it was not a pleasant situation. My parents took me out of the school most of the time under pretext that I had health issues.
Okay. Well, in the midst of that, as you mentioned, the Germans begin their attack on the Soviet Union. And part of that would include going through the Baltic countries and Latvia. And so how did the people of Latvia see the German occupation, at least in the earliest moments of that?
Well, first of all, this is, again, not widely understood, but some people are gaining some understanding that the communists had done such a horrible job by killing so many people that any change from communism was welcomed. So initially, the reaction to the Germans were positive. And I think the same thing, actually, believe it or not, was in Ukraine in 1941, because as you well know, the Ukrainians have been starved and suppressed by Stalin. I think in the 1930s, about 2.5 million Ukrainians starved to death. But afterwards, the Germans put in their functionaries in the government, and their idea was, well, look, this originally was settled by the German monks centuries ago. Maybe this should be the German territory again. And they were basically putting quotas that people on the farms had to give them food. And I think their long range plan probably was to colonize with Germans, but we're not exposed to much. But basically, I think they were using as a source of food and just to support their army. So the choice that the people had in the German occupation was really very limited. And I refer to this in my book briefly. Number one, there was an opposition. Yes. What was the opposition? The opposition was communists. Did you want to have communists back that killed 3% of the population in 1 year? Obviously, most people didn't. What's the other one? Independence. Family friend who was the grandson, actually the son of the first president of Latvia, felt that he was a good friend of my mother's and classmates, that they should strive for independence and cooperate with the Allies. Well, the Allies were not interested in that. They were interested in cooperating with Germans. So poor guy, they found out his activities, and he got put in a German concentration camp. So there's really no option. So you probably just lie low and think about your own survival. And, the other thing, you have to be very fair. The Allies had completely neglected that area. I mean, they were interested in cooperating with the Russians. So.
Right. And I know in general on the Eastern Front, in some areas, the Germans were very aggressive towards civilians. Of course, they were rounding up Jews and other minority groups, but ultimately Hitler's plan was to create living space for Germans to live in the East. It seems as if the experience in the Baltic countries was not quite as severe as some of the other places. Do you think that might have been maybe some German ethnic views of the Slavic people versus the Baltic countries?
That might have played a role, because you see, this interesting part is I lived in the countryside as a child. I don't think I met a Jewish person until I was 15. So they were mostly in the urban areas. Now, the irony of this is that some of the more successful and prosperous Jewish people also suffered under communists. They were deported too. So there was a kind of a, we heard, that there were people arrested, as you said, from ethnic groups and Jewish people, but we just heard it because I was not in the city. I didn't know much, but subsequently, obviously, the history record shows that the Germans did round up Jewish people in Latvia, as well as in the surrounding Baltic countries. The minority of Jewish people was a little higher in Lithuania, and certainly very high in Poland. I think it's a terrible thing what they did. But, when you're fighting for your own survival, you hear all kinds of rumors, and, that only you find the facts much later on. The Germans handled the propaganda pretty well, I'd say that.
In your book, you share one story of how your mother was having a visit with some German officers, and they were asking questions, and whether there was still some communist sympathizers around. And could you tell us a little bit of how that story unfolded?
Well, that story is, I found it fascinating now if I look it back. My mother spoke perfect German because she was also educated at Heidelberg University, and she spoke four other languages besides German and Latvian. And so the transportation system was pretty bad, and some of the Germans were fairly cooperative. So she was trying to come back from the capital to our house and somebody suggested, well, there are these German officers driving past, they could give her a ride and drop her off. So she accepted that. And, we had met German soldiers before, they were mostly Wehrmacht. I saw these people drive up with this Mercedes, and they sure looked different. They were black uniforms, shining boots, big Mercedes, and the chauffeur jumped out. And my mother kind of said, well, why don't you come and have tea and thank you for the ride? So they come in and have tea, and I was sitting there and listening in because I knew some German. And they were clicking their heels when they met my grandmother. And then toward the end, they said, tell us how it was during the communist time. And my mother said, well, the state was taken over by the communists, and, they had a tractor school and all this. And they kept saying, how terrible, how terrible. So one of them said, are there any of these people left? And my mother said, no, most of them escaped, except the technical director of the school is still here. He's charged the machine shop. Well, one of the Germans said, after we finished the tea, how terrible the situation is. We're going to shoot the guy because he's a communist. My mother said, no, he's essential. We would like, and she tried to talk him out. So finally she convinced him, saying, well, look, he's essential to keep the machine shop going so we can supply the food to the war effort and all this. And so the German officer said, all right, madam, we've been your guests. We'll honor your wishes, and then departed. After that, my mother never accepted ride from any Germans because these guys were not the regular army. They were SD, which is the security part of the SS. So they were probably out hunting for communists or something. So life was pretty cheap then.
I think that this is one of the things that people don't realize, is that there were different arms of the German military, and the culture within them was different. Some people, I think, maybe based on movies, assume that every German soldier was a monster who was ready to kill any innocent at a moment's notice, when that really was not the case. I knew a family from Holland, and they were there during the occupation, and they shared stories of, yes, there was German violence against civilians, but there was plenty of times that where they shared what little they had, and there were acts of compassion by the Germans as well, that they weren't all monsters. What was your impression, aside from this party of SDs? Did you see the Germans as being an acceptable presence in your community?
Well, I think I remember the first exposure to this was when my parents, when the country was still independent, the war was starting, and my father was talking to his friends, and they had traveled a great deal to Europe and lived there some time. And I think what he said, that they did not like Hitler, and they said Hitler does not represent the best of Germany, and they could not understand how Germans, being highly educated and cultural people, could select him as his leader. So I think that was probably the perception of my parents. But my other observation was we had another German officer quartered on and off, and he was a vet. His responsibility was to collect horses for the army, because I think many people don't know, they think that the German army was motorized. Not at all. 3/4 of transportation was by horses. So he was in our house collecting horses. And so we tried to be terribly nice to him because we wanted to save our own horses. And, he was a kind of easygoing guy, as people in the medical professions are. And we learned he was a Bavarian, and he really didn't like the war. He couldn't talk much about it, but he says, I had to work with the Prussians, so put up with the war effort. So I think there's it boils down to the individuals. And I think one of the things about the Germans is that they were very careful to express their views to outsiders, because that was, no for the Nazi party and their military careers. But there was a great difference between the Austrians and the Bavarians and the typical German military people.
And so this German occupation is taking place, and then at one point the German advance into the Soviet Union is stopped, and then it is turned around, and now the Soviets are on their way. Describe for us what that was like as you're hearing rumors that the Soviets are coming back.
Well, I think that, no one knew what was going to happen initially when the Germans advanced. It looked like a German victory and people were hoping peace or some kind of thing. And then we started learning that the German front really collapsed. Well, in times of stress, you said, oh, this is not going to happen. Things are going to continue. The front was away about 150 miles. And then during the summer of 1904, the Soviets started this Operation Bagration, and it virtually collapsed the central German front. The northern part held out, as did the southern. And within a matter of weeks, the Russians broke through. There was no resistance. And I was playing in the fields one day, we heard front was away 50 miles. We could see some smoke there. And suddenly the tanks had broken through, and my parents were told that the tanks are only about 15 miles away and we had to get out. So that things changed so suddenly. So we threw everything in a couple of carts and took off ahead of the supposedly Russian troops. And we headed to my stepfather's house, which was some distance away. And we, in the middle of the trip, we were going to meet my stepfather's cart from his farm so we could load the bags. And the person who, one of the persons who was driving back our horses was a former Russian POW. And I never forgotten that. And he had worked for us. Two of them had worked for us for about 3 years, which is much better than being in POW camp. And as we were leaving and transferred our baggage to the other cart, that former POW, his name was Timofey, hugged my mother and said, "May the good Lord protect you and save you for a better life." That's kind of unusual expression from the Russian Soviet former POW. And so then we transferred to my stepfather's house, which we did not realize was much closer to the Russians. And we packed up our bags and we had to get out of there. And we left there at 4 o'clock, and I think in the morning, and 3 hours later, the Soviets were there, and they caught some of the refugees and shot them. So also Timofey was shot by the Russians because he felt the Soviets felt that any POW was disloyal. So very sad.
Yeah, I can't imagine being a Russian POW, because there really is no hope. You
Exactly.
can't escape with the Germans. You can't
Exactly
go back to the Russians, and so it's a hopeless situation. Yeah, and so they come back, and things return to some difficult moments again.
Well, what happened is, so we got out of the house and traveled about 50 miles further west. And then the Germans brought in reinforcements. They brought in one of their elite division, which I'm sure you're familiar, Grossdeutschland. And then, of course, the famous tank leader was called, there's a book by him about him, The Devil's General, Graf Strachowitz. And they made an attack on the Russians and dislodged them. So then we could return to our houses. And they had been under Soviet occupation for about a month and a half. And so we looked at the place the way it was again. So, and then we were there for another month or so, and the front was away about five miles away. And then afterwards, we realized when the next Soviet offensive started, which was, I think, October 17th, 1944, we better get out. They couldn't hold it too long. But the fighting there was very fierce. Just to give you a reference point, in 1944, originally the Russians had surrounded these German troops. There were about 500,000 Germans, probably close to 2 million, 1.5 million Soviet troops. Then toward the end, as a pocket shrunk, the Germans were down to 300,000, 200,000. And eventually, before the war ended, in early, it would be in May in 1945, they were down to about 250,000 troops. But the Russians never could crush that pocket. And the Russian intent was, Stalin's strategy was to crush this pocket, then deploy the extra 2 million troops or whatever they had to Berlin. Hitler's general staff recommended withdrawal from Courland. That's how the area was called. And they said, you have to withdraw the troops from Courland and redeploy to defend Germany. Hitler said no. And the reason why he said no, he had the grand illusion that this would be base for a further advancement in Russia. Now, if Hitler had listened to his general staff, the Germans would have withdrawn and I would have been left behind. So, why did this happen? I don't know.
Wow. Wow. Well, I think I'd like to leave it there and point people towards the book, An Unexpected
Well, I'd like to
Journey.
show it to you. Here it is.
There it is. Yes, it is. It is very good, and definitely would recommend people pick that up. Do you have a website that people could go to?
No, I don't. I tell you this, if you don't want to read the book and don't have the time, my suggestion is look at the cover, which you see now, and read the reviews in Amazon. And there are a lot of reviews. And the other thing is, if you want to have some additional information, I even have my email address in the back, which is very simple. It says hello@John H. Livens, Livens.com.
Okay.
If you have any questions, be delighted to answer.
Excellent.
But I think I'll read the summary, not the summary, the key that the editor said, and I don't know how meaning is that to you, but I'll put my glasses and read. And this is what the editor pulled out. My life shows that we as humans cannot always change or control our circumstances. We cannot anticipate all the obstacles in our path. We can, however, choose our attitude, our actions, and how to overcome the obstacles. This will define our character, values, and faith. So,
well, that's an excellent way to conclude this time together. Thank you so much, John, for your time. I've enjoyed talking with you and hearing your stories.
Well, I would also like to add that you're one of the few people who has an understanding what went on there. They don't really understand the dynamics of the different German troops and the different political moves. So it was a real pleasure for me.
The Second World War Podcast with Stephen Bedard. World War II changed our world dramatically. Our maps and technology were all transformed in ways that still affect us. This podcast starts with the origins and moves on to the worldwide conflict between the Axis and the Allies. Learn the background and understand how Europe, Africa, and Asia were torn apart by the greed for more power and resources. Hear the stories of Montgomery and Churchill, Eisenhower and Patton, Goering and Rommel. We will go through the entire conflict, focusing on the big picture rather than the details. If you've ever wanted to know more about the Second World War, this is your chance. Listen to the podcast at anchor.fm/Second World War or on your favorite podcatcher. And find more resources, including blog posts, at stephenjbedard.com/Second World War.